The most important part of getting a good clean mix is starting with a good clean composition. It's really hard to get a clean mix when you've got elements that are stepping on each other and frequencies that are stacking up in the beginning, idea building phase. So today I want to go through my song Looking Back, walk you through quickly all the compositional things I was thinking to make sure elements weren't stepping on one another, and then go through every single element, plugin, effect that I was using so that you guys can make songs that sound like this. So this is the full project file for Looking Back. It's an insanely simple song, and truth be told, if you heard the snippet I just played, you pretty much heard the whole thing. I think that makes this a pretty good candidate for going through and doing a really detailed mix breakdown, because I don't need to spend too much time going through all the compositional elements. But for clarity's sake, I do want to discuss exactly what layers I put in and why, so that you guys can be thinking about how to approach your own lo-fi beats. To start things off, we had a piano and then a layered like electric piano sort of Rhodes thing on Serum. Just going along with my good old friend Lab Soft Piano. Just arpeggiating through a nice chord progression here. I actually clicked this in, I was feeling lazy that day. Nothing too fancy, just two hands, left hand's doing, a full chord triad held out for a measure, while the right hand arpeggiates through the chord and then sort of lets it ring for a couple beats in between to leave space for the counter melodies that I add in later. Listening to just the chord layers by themselves, here they are. So you can hear that space was pretty intentional, and if this were the only melodic element, it would be extremely boring, which is exactly why I added some counter melodies on the keys, and then this pretty cool flute that I'm excited to get into the stylistic mixing I did on, but more on that later. I think you can hear it's still feeling pretty thin at this point, so of course I added a pad to fill out that body. So now that we've gone through the sound of the few layers separately, I want to talk a little bit about the intention behind where I place them in their own registers. So for the chords, obviously you've got two layers playing the exact same thing, and that's a case where stacking frequencies, essentially having multiple instruments on the exact same notes, makes perfect sense, right? Because the chord layer is essentially fortifying the motif that the piano chords are playing. It's giving a body and a little bit of a new identity to the sound, but it's not moving forward with the intent of pulling attention away from it, right? You're essentially just transforming the sound by stacking frequencies. Not a hard and fast rule, but try to be intentional when you are stacking frequencies. You don't want like every element to all be, between 500 and 600 hertz. You end up with a really weird song. And then I knew that we're sort of focused on the low mids with the chords, so I knew that I wanted a counter melody to fill in those spaces, something higher up that wouldn't be stepping on the tails of the chord progression. So that's where I added this really high octave piano and then an even higher flute part to really fill in that space. And something I want you to kind of take note here is that the piano counter melody really finishes its line before the flute swells into view, I guess, before the flute takes over. So in just the first measure, we have essentially passed through three different registers with, the low mids, we'll call the key counter melody the high mids, and the flutes has some really high highs. And, in the first 4 beats of the drop, we've got 3 different registers that all take the focus, but they all take their turn with the focus. And then as far as the pad goes, I think this is another case of stacking with the chords, because we're essentially just fortifying the home. We're giving the whole loop a body. So obviously all of this has been focused on like the mid to high range stuff, so it wouldn't be a full track without the bass, which I went super simple on this. Literally just root notes on a really strong bass, and I'll get a little bit more into the why and the how. But this was sort of the full melodic loop before I added like the lead parts, which were the guitars. So you can hear the bass is super subby, still very present, but it's not like buzzing, it's not crazy distorted, like blowing into those like mids, and definitely not the highs, because again, we want the bass to have its own space in the frequency spectrum. As far as the drums go, I think the only interesting things to talk about in this part are just sort of making sure that you got sound selection that matches the vibe you're going for. When it comes to mixing drums, sound selection is going to be your best friend. It's the first step and probably the most important in really any mix. You need to make sure that you're not picking samples with like clicks and pops, you know, weird buzzing. That's the minimum. And then, you know, ideally you're getting things that have the right timbre and feel for the exact sound you're going for. So in this case, I was sort of setting out to be like, I mean, maybe on the sleepy side. This is a kind of triumphant beat for a sleepy lo-fi song, but I basically picked sounds that like weren't super harsh, weren't crazy punchy, like nice kind of like a subby kick with not a ton of transients. And then, well, actually I layered some kicks. I had a really subby kick with kind of like a, you know, a mid to strong transient. And then the second kick had a much stronger transient, which I would actually caution against layering kicks most of the time. You'll often run into weird phasing issues. It just so happened that in this case, I liked the phasing that I got out of these two kicks combined. Sort of gave me the complement of the subbiness with actually a softer transient than what I had with either one of them by themselves. And then same thing with your snares. You don't want, like, for a sleepy beat, you don't want like a big, loud, reverbed out snare. You want something kind of snappy that you can reverb yourself. And the hi-hat's sort of the same thing. Keep them light, keep them simple. Try to avoid anything too clicky and too harsh. All of those elements together are starting to sound like this. And then the final kind of piece of the puzzle was getting my guitar parts going here. In the first drop, I sort of introduced one guitar at a time and let them all come in at the end. But this was very much meant to be the front of the beat. It was supposed to be the thing the ears go to. So you're going to hear that it's far and away the loudest part of the beat. But we'll get into the mix a little bit more in a minute. So the only other things that I didn't talk about as far as the composition goes were a few Foley loops. I did, I think, literally nothing with any of these as far as like EQ goes. I just took them right out of the box. That's composition. That's like the thought behind the placement of all of it. But let's get into the actual like techniques and plugins I was using to make sure everything stayed where I had it in my mind. Because if you listen to it without any of the effects, it absolutely is not where I wanted it in my mind. So this is a product of what I think is the second most important part of getting a good mix, and that's mixing as you go. I have never heard the beat sound like this because I never got to the point that all of these elements were here before a bunch of these stylistic decisions were made. And I think that makes the final mix a lot easier because as soon as I add an element, like you heard that flute sounded so weird. And that's because as soon as I knew I wanted a flute part, I wanted it to be sparkly, I wanted it to be twinkly, I dove in and I mixed it exactly like that. That's tip number 2, absolutely mix as you go. Every time you add an element, think about where you want it to land and then put it there. So let's dive through exactly how I did that. So we're gonna start things off with our nice piano chord here. If you've been around the channel, you know I love me some Lab soft piano. This is what it sounded like, you know, without anything on it. Very quiet, very soft. It's a soft piano. I've just got the reverb up at 31%, so not completely dry coming out. So the first thing I did to it was basically just throw a compressor on, which in this case I mostly did to get the gain way up. I boosted it by 10 dB, which is a boatload, and I put the threshold down. I'm not even actually sure that this is actually compressing anything, but I left everything else pretty much alone. And from there I added Valhalla Supermassive, the small and wide preset, on a 50% mix. Tiny little bit of sound goodizer, basically just functioning as a little bit more compression. And what do you know? Even more compression. Once again, I put about like 6 dB of gain and a little bit more aggressive of threshold, just sort of tame out those aggressive chord hits. This limiter's here because I wanted to sidechain it to the kick, but I'll get into more of that in a few minutes. And then finally, I did a very gentle scoop out of the 300 hertz range because I was getting some pile up with the chord progression. So this is what it sounded like with everything on. So effectively, you can feel that most of what I was doing here was just giving an already nice sound some body, right? I wanted it to be forward enough in the mix to be heard over everything, but didn't do anything too crazy stylistically with that. With the chord layer, I was actually pretty happy with the volume right out of Serum in this case. So once again, this is sort of like a wonky sine wave oscillator with a healthy low pass filter on it. A pretty plucky attack. We got a 3.6 millisecond attack time, nothing too wild. But that gives you a nice, that's just gonna ring out for days. And then in the built-in effects rack, we've got a bunch of things that are turned on, but the mix is turned to 0 on most of them, or I've just got the compressor doing a little bit of work for me to kind of squish the sound, and then another low pass filter to kind of round it out. Once I copied the chords into that, sent it over to my mixer channel, I did another side chaining limiter. You're gonna find there's a lot of that, and then a high pass EQ because I wanted to leave plenty of room for the bass. So this is really the first instance of me doing some sort of intentional mixing, is putting things in a specific frequency range, right? Like I said, mix as you go. I knew for a fact that I was going to be adding bass to this later, and I didn't want my ears to get used to the sound of having some rich low end. So I immediately just cut everything above like 150 hertz, 160 hertz basically. Now for the flute layer, we had a little bit of fun. This is where things got a little bit more interesting. So I pulled the flute in from BBC Symphony Orchestra, awesome free plugin from Spitfire Audio. Actually, it looks like this was even a piccolo. So I knew, again, like I said, I wanted that really high frequency stuff. The piccolo is basically as high as it gets as far as organic instruments go. So yeah, you heard that without any of the effects, it sounded pretty wonky in the context of the beat. There's very little attack and almost no release whatsoever. So the first thing I added was a delay. Basically played with delay time until I liked what I heard. So that helps with our release problem. It makes it a little bit more gradual. I threw it on the ping pong effect so it goes side to side. Left it 100% wet and brought the level down just a little bit. I then put a little convolution reverb on. Looks like it's an Impulse for Church 2, just right out of FL Studio, shout out. And I did not touch the wet and dry settings. And that to me smooths out both the attack and the decay time, where the delay is less of a distinctive echo and a little bit more smooth, but still gives it that waviness I liked. Put a little early stereo enhancer on there just to really get it wide in the stereo field because I knew that I wanted this to be more textural than melodic. So that did this. You can hear that's especially affecting the ping pong of the delay. And then a little bit counterintuitively, despite this being an instrument that I wanted really high, I decided to scoop out a ton of the high information because it was sounding a little bit harsh and I didn't super love it. So this is what it sounded like with a massive duck at 2400 hertz. So that sort of rounded things out a little bit nicer, made it a little bit smoother to feed into the real magic here with gross beat. This really isn't that fancy, but I really like what it did to it. So essentially, I just put it on a fast tremolo setting to give it that real sparkle that I liked. And finally, some pan-o-matic. I just wanted this thing floating between your ears. And this helped me do just that. Wrap it all up with a pretty healthy dose of some pretty small reverb, and you basically got what I ended up with here. So moving over to this key counter melody part. Yeah, I more or less just copied the chord effects chain, which if you're an FL Studio user, pro tip, you can right click on the mixer channel, file, save mixer track state as, and you can drag it over to any mixer track. So I'll go to an empty one here, and now this, empty channel has the exact same effects and settings as this one does. So if you're in a case like this where you want to mix two different parts separately but have them have the same effect processing, this is a good way to do it quickly. So yeah, I essentially just copied most of what was in the chord piano part, and then I added a little bit of extra reverb. So I've got the Space Verb 1999 preset on Valhalla Supermassive. It's mixed to 50% on the plugin and then 54% on the actual mixer rack. And so both of these knobs are examples of something called parallel processing, where a gross oversimplification of the concept is that the mix is essentially telling you what percentage of the signal coming out of the plugin is the affected signal versus the unaffected signal. So in this gross oversimplification, the Valhalla Supermassive is basically delivering a 50% wet or a 50% reverbed signal to the rest of whatever is in my effects chain. Because if you didn't know this already, the order that you have things in the effects rack is actually the order that they're applied in. So all of the compression's gone into this piano, the compressed signal is then sent into Valhalla Supermassive, and then the reverb signal is sent into this next EQ. But the reason I turned down on the plugin and on the channel rack is because usually changing the mix on a plugin does more than just send 50% wet and dry. Like I said, it's a gross oversimplification. So sort of to counteract that, I just turned the mix down on the channel, or I turned the mix down on the mixer, because this is a much more true 50% of what's coming through is just the compressed signal, and the other 50% is what's coming out of Valhalla. And then yeah, coming out of there, I did the same thing that I did in the chord layer and just sawed off the lows. This time I went a bit higher, all the way up to 250 hertz, because the counter keys are way up high. So without anything, this is what it sounds like. Very quiet, very subdued. Turn everything on, it's very present and a little bit more spacious. And let's take a peek at the pad. So this pad is actually just a sound from Flex. It's a built-in FL Studio synth. It's got pretty limited control. You don't have control over the type of oscillators you have. It's all basically preset and sound banks. But you do have full control over some classic ADSR envelopes, a little bit of effects that are built in, and some filters. I cannot tell you if I change this from the stock. All I know is that I liked it at some point, and then in the heat of the moment, I decided that this was just what the song needed. So right out of Flex, the pad sounded like this. Just nice and gradual, a really good reverb on it already. There's not a lot of harsh, upper resonances. I think it's actually pretty good sound for a pad. But I wanted more. So here's what I did. I threw on a multi-band compressor. So this is FL's version of OTT. I actually think you get a little bit more control with this one. So a multi-band compressor essentially just divides a sound into 3 bins of frequency. You've got your low, medium, and high, and then ideally you can apply different amounts of compression and gain, different thresholds and ratios to each of those bins of frequencies. So for this pad, I can't tell what I did, but let's hear what it did to the pad. So it sounds like it sort of brought up the mids a little bit and gave it just a little bit more presence. It seems like this is the theme of this mix, is just sort of giving things a little bit more presence and doing some gain. Once again, brought the stereo enhancer right in there, turned that thing to 32% separated because I love a nice wide pad. Really just that you feel it, you don't even really hear it. And that really brings out these small motions that you don't hear kind of right out of the plugin that I really like. There's like a built-in delay that I think is ping-ponging a little bit, and I think the stereo enhancer sort of really pulls that out of it. I've got another side-chained fruity limiter here just to help that kick punch through. Once again, I'll talk about that in a moment. And then in this case, I did a pretty massive low pass all the way down to, well, I'm letting things through up to 2000 hertz. Pretty gradual, you know, I didn't want like a sharp peak. You can end up with some weird problem with phasing issues there, so I would avoid like super harshly EQing your pads, but a nice roll off the top all the way down to the mids, I guess in this case, is I think pretty reasonable to do. So after all that, it went from this to this. So you can hear how like this was more of a stylistic thing. It didn't really change the space it was occupying, but it definitely gave it a lot more like warmth and maybe a little bit more body. Let's take a peek at the bass. If you've been around the channel, you know I am a huge fan of this free plugin Key Bass. Very rich, warm, subby synth bass that I think gives a nice foundation to most of my lo-fi tracks these days. Right out of the box, it is a killer. Let me get that nice and loud for... So by itself, the bass is super subby, super rich really in those low notes. But because I left a ton of room for bass in this track, I actually wanted to add a lot more upper resonances in this case. And the way that you do that to any sound is through distortion. For this effects chain, I started with two sort of different approaches to distortion. I've got the Fruity Wave Shaper here. It's functionally just a gain plugin, but it does sort of have like a limiting effect if you push it hard enough. I don't think I did in this case. It just sort of gave it a little bit of a boost. Nothing crazy transformative there, just a little bit louder. And then I ran it through Destructor on the soft sat setting with the filter chorus and speaker turned off, so it's just for the distortion sounds. Left everything else alone. And now you can start to hear that buzzing starting to come out. And then once again, a little bit of soft clipper just to, yeah, I mean, soft clip it. Soft clipping will also sort of result in some slight distortion. With any of these things, you really don't want to overdo it in any one case. That's actually a pretty important thing to touch on here. It would have been easy for me to just absolutely blast it through the Destructor to get whatever amount of harmonic content I wanted out of it. But by serializing these things and doing a little bit at a time, there's this like additive effect that helps you control what you're adding a lot better. That's pretty much true for most effects processing you're doing. Anytime you can stack things, you know, especially EQing, rather than trying to EQ a bunch of weird, crazy peaks in just one single instance, try to achieve one thing per instance of EQ, for example, or in this case, per instance of, you know, distortion or gain. You know, end up with like quite as many phasing issues or sort of like weird artifacts that come from really pushing one plugin hard. So yeah, like I said, I added some upper resonances here, some distortion, which maybe this is a good thing to show you with the EQ. This was, you know, what the EQ signature looked like for the bass with no distortion. Sort of pay special attention to this space right here where I did the roll off. That was essentially where I was trying to add the frequencies. So this is no distortion. You know, pretty strong info down in the sub, and there's definitely some resonances up here. But then when we add the distortion back in, you get this whole new population of peaks all the way up here, and a much stronger presence of peaks through like these mids. So let's toggle that on and off a couple times while it's playing. So hopefully you can both visually and, you know, hear. I'm not sure what you guys are monitoring on, obviously, but if you do have something that can hear that bass, hopefully you can hear that there was a little bit of purpose to that whole section of the video. Anywho, as far as drum mixes go, for this track, for some reason, I really didn't do too much. I did tell you that I had sidechained the kick to basically everything because I really wanted the kick to thump through this track. So what you do is with, you know, the mixer track with the kick selected, you right click on this little arrow down here, side chain to this track. It routes one of these fancy little green wires. And then the way I like to do my side chaining is to throw in a fruity limiter because it's super easy to do. It's going to open up in the limit tab. You want to move over to the comp tab, right click on sidechain and select the drop down. From there, you're going to adjust your threshold and your ratio. This is a super visual plugin, so it's actually a really nice thing to explore as you're trying to learn about compression and sidechaining. But in general, what I try to do is get my threshold down to, you know, whatever sounds good, but the starting point is that it's got to be at least to where the volume is. And then I adjust my ratio from there to make sure that I'm not like, you know, completely cutting the volume out, but it's also still doing something. So let's have a look at what it's doing to the chords with the kick side chain. So a quick breakdown of what you're looking at here. This white line is essentially the amount of sidechain compression that's happening. Every time it dips down, sidechain compression is being applied. And then the white at the bottom is the volume of the chord, the piano in this case. And then this purple space is basically the difference between what the volume was and what the compression pushed it down to. So for maybe like a stronger waveform where we've still got the kick sidechain to the bass, you can see that we get a little bit or quite a bit more cut into that bass because we've got this long sustained low. And because the bass and the kick occupy the same frequencies, we've got the kick really slamming the bass down so that the kick has plenty of space and they're not stepping on one another. So you can see here, we're looking at like essentially a 50% reduction in volume. That's sort of the function of the sidechain in this. I basically applied the kick to anything that had a lot of low information and then even some stuff that I just kind of wanted to pulsate with the kick a bit. So I had it on the chords, the chord layer. I had it on the pad because I didn't do anything to high pass the pad, so there's still a little bit of bass information left in there. And then I sidechained it to my guitar sends, which I'm going to get into in a moment. But that was, again, just to sort of give it a little bit of the pulse that I wanted. That wasn't so much about fighting with frequencies. Just to keep things going with the drums real quick. The snare, I usually actually like to do my snare reverb on sends, and that's a different version of parallel processing. But in this case, I ended up doing a fruity convolver, just nice convolution reverb on the default setting. Mixed way down to like 30%. So this is the same thing as routing the snare volume to another mixer channel, throwing fruity convolver on it, turning it to 100, and then dragging the mixer down to 30%. In this case, I just did it right on the effect rack. The snare kind of with and without. So you can hear, obviously, gives it a lot more space. Takes up just a little bit more room in the mix, which I tend to favor most of the time. The hats, I did absolutely nothing to. Shout out to, looks like I used Mondo loops and Prithvi's hi-hats, so high quality samples, gentlemen. Once again, didn't really do anything crazy mixing, just a lot of leveling with these transition sounds. And then finally, the piece de resistance, my glorious ugly guitar effects chain, to compensate for my nightmarish guitar setup. So this is what right out of my guitar plug DI into my audio interface sounded like. It's so dinky. And then I ran this into, I think I've talked about this preset on the channel before as well, the Archetype Plini amp simulator. They've got an Electric Sunrise intro preset. Doesn't look like I did too much to this. I actually boosted some of the highs because I think the bass was really holding its own in this one. So I didn't want to step on that really at all with the guitar. Ended up sounding a little bit thin, I think, but I think it was a sacrifice that paid off in the end when I added the rest of the layers. So now dry straight into my PC handled that. So yeah, this ended up like really plucky. The transients are super aggressive. And my foolish self decided not to use a transient processor, instead do a bunch of convoluted compression. So learn from my mistakes, people. Grab a transient processor. I actually would recommend Kilohertz. They've got a free transient processor. It works great. It's all you really need. Just adjust those attack times and don't do what I'm about to show you, but I'll show you what I did anyway, just to show you how you can be resourceful without downloading a bunch of plugins. So first thing I did, threw a limiter on. Well, fruity limiter, I actually used it as a compressor just to really tame those initial peaks. So you can see trying to peek through here are those really aggressive transients. So this is just a super fast attack. I think it's, yeah, immediate. So it's still kind of gonna have some pop, but it's gotta get rid of those like tough plucks of the pick hitting the string. Added a multi-band compressor in this case. Brought the highs down a bit. I think I left most everything else alone. Maybe mess with some thresholds. I'm sorry, I don't remember exactly what I did with all these. Like I said, I made this 8 months ago, so hopefully this is still helpful. But the multi-band compressor, so that, of course, added a ton of gain, really brought those mids through. Brought in an EQ to, once again, like I said, leave lots of room for the bass. I don't want any mud in this one. And I got rid of a really harsh frequency at 329 and then scooped out a little bit in the high mids as well. So this, I think, helped kind of round it out a bit. Added some sound goodizer. This is basically just it's like a preset on Maximus, which is another, compressor limiter thing. So this is just colored compression. Just basically all I was doing with that. Didn't do any crazy bit. A little bit of soft clipper here. Just sort of to give it a little bit more distortion, a little bit more fuzz. Same thing with Destructor on the soft sat preset once again. And then I brought Maximus in, and it looks like use this as a little bit more of a gentle compressor, just to try to tame those transients once more. So you can hear through that extra compression, a little bit of distortion. It really started to give it that character that you can hear in the final track. But stylistically, I threw a nice vintage chorus on. I don't know if this is a preset or not. Give it a little bit of style, a little bit of something. Threw some chorus on, mixed pretty low, only 27%. Again, parallel processing versus doing just 100% wet. And limited it one more time. Oh, and then this one was the side chain that I mentioned to the kick. So that was what I recorded every guitar into. Well, I recorded it and then mixed them all like this. That was actually, I think, what I did in this case. And then because, like I said, the amp sim is so brutal on my CPU, I ended up consolidating each individual part to audio and then processing them a bit more by themselves. Let's take a peek at this guy. My main guitar, after everything that I ran through in the recording chain, I also added Fresh Air, which is adding a little bit more of high end just to help it peek through what was a pretty high end focus, mid-high focus mix at this point. Getting into the dangerous territory of stacking frequencies, but I think it was, I think it worked out in this case. And then one additional high pass, pretty aggressive roll off, 150 Hertz. Just keep things away from the bass. I want to leave the bass alone and not have a super muddy low end on this. So then after that, I recorded this high guitar, which is a nice like harmony. It's just this little laser. So anyway, so like I said, I added a high harmony on the guitar. So this is another instance of letting them have their own space, right? So I ran it through all the same effects that I showed you on the print, and then did an even higher low pass filter to, essentially the melodic information from the main guitar comes all the way down to around here, but the melodic stuff comes down only around like 400 or 500 hertz in the high guitar. So I did a roll off to everything that wasn't important. It, again, makes it feel pretty thin, but I think in the context of the track, it's, full enough for my taste anyway. And then after that, I sent both of them to a bus. Both of these channels are only going to the guitar send in this case. So that's similar. Have the track selected, right click on the arrow. You can route to this track or route to this track only. So if you want it to parallel process, you route to this track, that includes it. If you want to route to this track only, you can make a send, which is what I'm doing here. So both of the guitars and then later the verse guitar are all routed to this guitar send, which has another space verb 1999 from Valhalla Supermassive mixed at 50% on the plugin and 25% on the mix rack. And then you didn't think we were going to make it the whole video without me talking about TDR Nova, did you? Here I've got the thing that I think actually really saved this guitar part in a big way, because this is a dynamic EQ, and so essentially you can think of it like a compressor for just defined frequencies, which in this case I've got it targeted, or one of the peaks anyway, targeted to 250 hertz, where I was getting some pile up, especially when they came together, and especially when I added the reverb. So what this does is as soon as it hits the threshold, in this case minus 13 dB, it applies a 2-to-1 compression ratio. So you'll see that when I play, the volume is reduced, according to the volume at that frequency. And then who would I be without sidechaining the kick to this as well? So the final little piece of the pie, this is a track that has very little of it, but I think it's still actually super important to nailing down a really good mix, and that's effects automation. So it's both a stylistic thing, but also really a balancing thing when you're being super intentional with it. So in this case, I really only did some stylistic leveling and then master volume in and out for the fade ins and out. But as far as what I actually did on this track, I had EQ mix on the pad at the beginning. So in this case, I wanted to create some separation between the intro and the first drop by using a little bit of effects automation. And in this track, I basically did all of that energy, focused all of that energy on the pad. So I started things off by having the low pass EQ, which I showed you in the breakdown part, all the way up, mixed 100%, and then had that suddenly drop off right before, or right as the drop hit, so the full spectrum was now playing through. And then I also automated the stereo enhancer to be all the way in the center, all the way out to, I think it was around like 30 something, or maybe like, yeah, 30% separated. So that's essentially taking something, just have it be like low warmth, really narrow, and then it starts to expand and then be full and bright. That was essentially just to create some contrast between the intro and the outro. And then you may have noticed when I was going through the flute earlier, I had these kind of weird like lines in the background that you might not have seen before. And that's because I did some volume automation in the channel volume. I don't know why I didn't talk about this when I first went through it, but here it is. What I did here was essentially just draw in the curve with my mouse for what I wanted the volume to do on each of these notes, which really contributed to that swelling sound that we got. So yeah, other than just automating the master volume up and down on the intro and outro, that was all the automation I did in this case. But I think some other really good places to use automation as far as, stylistic choices go. If you've got like a breakdown section or maybe for a transition, you could crank something like RC20 or some vinyl sounds, maybe throw a gross beat automation on there to really create some contrast with the elements that you already have and make it a little bit more dynamic. And then the other thing you want to think about is that between sections, it might be important for certain elements to go from being, the prominent melody to more of like a counter melody, in which case it's hard to have the volume be exactly the same in section A and section B. So you might want to volume automate a little bit between those sections, that the melodies aren't stepping on each other and trying too hard to, be the front, trying too hard to be at the front at the same time. I specifically didn't put how to master a lo-fi beat in the title of this because I'm not a mastering engineer. But because you guys stuck around this long, I'm going to give you guys the special treat of showing you my mastering chain. It's a little bit embarrassing, honestly, but gets the job done, and I'll walk you through exactly how and why I do what I do. So first thing to know is what is mastering and why do people master? So mastering in its, absolute simplest, most basic terms is really just making the song, or trying to get the song to sound the same no matter where it's played or who's playing it, right? So you want it basically to be as present in your car, on your studio monitors, on your phone, basically anywhere it might be heard. People should have a pretty similar experience listening to it. That's like what a mastering engineer does. That's what like good mastering's for. I'm not good at that. So like, full disclosure, don't overjudge. But as far as like mastering your lo-fi beats for things that are going to be heard in the background and you're just throwing it on Spotify, you want it to be good enough to keep up in the decent playlists. The big objective here is to get the loudness right where Spotify won't boost your volume super high to get it within their range, but they also won't compress the hell out of it and lose all of its character. Because if you did not know, Spotify has, a target loudness based on the LUFs. What are LUFs? Loudness units relative to full scale. Everybody knew that. So yeah, Spotify has a target of like -12 to -14 LUFs. And if you're way outside that range, your song ends up just getting compressed to fit it. So that's not really what you want. So to try to have your song keep the character that you intended it to, this is all this master chain is really for, is to make sure your loudness is where it's supposed to be. So here's what I do. Don't judge me. I've got this Loud Max plugin, which I believe is free, and I think the only reason it's on my mastering chain is because I watched an Eldre video like 5 years ago or something, where he put like 4 instances of this on his master, and he was like, yeah, that's it. So same, honestly. But threshold of -1.5 dB, and then the output -0.3 dB. That was exactly what he told me to do, and that is what I've done on almost every beat since I watched that video. That's bad advice, but that's what's going on. That's why I didn't include mastering in the title. So then this is where, I got a little bit more of my, actual sensibility in this thing. If we ignore the Loud Max, what I've got here is 2 instances of Maximus, right? So you've probably heard of like layering compressors, one to catch the peak and one to glue everything. That's basically what I'm doing here on my like mastering compression, where both instances are set to a true peak of 1.5, where they're like just hard limiting. They're not letting anything through that -1.5 dB ceiling. And then I just crank the gain on this until I get it up, kind of pushing that limiter until it starts applying some compression to whatever those loudest moments are. And then I've got the second instance with the exact same settings without the gain pushed to just sort of catch anything that's breaking through that initial limiter to really make sure that we're not blasting past that -1.5 dB ceiling. This is maybe the most important plugin in my mastering chain as far as making sure things sound good. And this is the most important plugin in my mastering chain to make sure things are loud enough. So on the left, we've got Voxengo Span. This is actually an awesome plugin. I think it's a super important part of every one of my masters. This is the only thing that I'm confident in using. So this is just a spectral mapper, basically. When I play the song, you're going to see the loudness of the full frequency range. And what you should be going for is something pretty close to a flat frequency range. So let's go to this like second drop, for example, and have a look at what all the frequencies look like on the song playing at the same time. So perhaps not super unsurprisingly, there's definitely like a low, skew. The basses are a bit higher than, well, way higher than the highs, which is pretty standard for lo-fi to begin with, but the mids are kind of poking through a little bit more. Not super surprising in this case, but I did learn pretty quickly that my ear and my setup tended to favor much louder bass than the mix actually called for. And once I started using this, I realized that my bass was way too loud in a lot of my tracks. This actually helped a lot. I'd recommend you grab it, or at least something similar, to make sure that you're not missing anything with whatever your setup or your own proclivities are. And then finally, this is the U-Lean loudness meter. So this is exactly how you test your tracks to find out if you're in that LUF range I was talking about. So like I said, Spotify is shooting from -14 to -12. That's also what a lot of labels are going for. And basically, you're going to want to pay attention to both the short term and the integrated. The integrated number is the one that labels are talking about when they say it has to be mastered to -12 to -14, because you're going to have really loud parts, you're going to have really quiet parts, but you want it to all come together to be right around, you know, that -14 number. I think the short term might matter a bit more for the Spotify stuff. You might end up getting a little bit more compression if your loudest part is like -8 LUF, but your integrated is -14. I think you're going to end up seeing things squish down a bit. Yeah, I guess let's listen to the loud part again and see what happens. So it actually looks like I probably could have cranked this master even more. These days I'm trying to push it up closer to that 12, maybe like 13.5, rather than hang around that -14. I think it just helps it stand out a little bit more on playlists. But in general, I think if you're hovering around that -14, you're gonna be in pretty good shape. So like I said, don't judge my mastering chain. If you have real questions about mastering, I would actually recommend going elsewhere, but I'm happy to talk about anything that I showed you in this video. I do hope it was helpful, and if it was, leave a comment, let me know, and let me know what you want to see me make next. So thanks for stopping by. See you.